The blast furnace never sleeps. Even at midnight, when most of Pittsburgh lies wrapped in uneasy dreams, the Homestead Steel Works glows like a man-made volcano against the Pennsylvania sky. Orange light flickers across the Monongahela River, painting the water in shades of molten copper while thick black smoke mingles with low-hanging clouds. Tonight we follow Katherine O'Brien as she makes her way through the narrow streets that wind between the mill and the company housing where steelworkers and their families live in conditions that would make those New York tenements look spacious. It's October 1884, and Katherine has exactly 43 minutes to reach the textile mill where she works the night shift, spinning cotton into thread that will travel thousands of miles to become clothing for people she'll never meet. You might wonder why a 19-year-old woman is walking alone through industrial Pittsburgh at midnight. Well, in the 1880s, factories ran around the clock. Daylight was for men's work in the steel mills and foundries. Darkness belonged to the women and children who kept the textile machines humming while the sun slept. The night shift paid 3 cents less per hour than day work, but it was steady employment, and in Katherine's world, steady employment meant the difference between eating and starving. Katherine pulls her thin shawl tighter as she passes the boarding house where her brother Patrick lives with 7 other Irish immigrants. The building leans slightly to one side, a victim of ground that has been shifting for years due to coal mining beneath the city. Most of Pittsburgh sits on top of an underground maze of mine shafts, and sometimes whole city blocks just sink a few inches without warning. The residents adapt. They always adapt. From Patrick's window comes the sound of an accordion and rough male voices singing an old ballad from County Cork. The night shift workers often gather in someone's room before heading to their respective factories. Not for celebration, mind you, but for something harder to define. Comfort, maybe. The reassurance that comes from shared misery and shared hope. Katherine doesn't stop. She learned early that lingering near groups of men, even her brother's friends, could invite the wrong kind of attention. A woman alone at night in industrial America walks a careful line between necessity and danger. Her route to the mill takes her through streets that transform completely after dark. During the day, these same sidewalks bustle with legitimate commerce, vendors selling everything from hot meals to used clothing. At night, different businesses emerge from the shadows. The smell hits her first as she turns onto Grant Street. Not the familiar blend of coal smoke and steel dust that hangs over the entire city like a permanent fog, but something more specific. Rotting meat from a butcher shop that can't afford proper refrigeration. Stale beer and vomit from the taverns that stay open all night to serve workers coming off shift. Human waste from privies that overflow faster than they can be emptied. You're probably thinking this sounds disgusting, and you're right. But Katherine has been breathing these smells for 3 years now, ever since her family arrived from Ireland with nothing but the clothes they wore and a letter from a cousin who promised them work in America's industrial paradise. Your nose adapts to almost anything when survival depends on adaptation. 2 blocks ahead, she can see the outline of the Allegheny Textile Mill, a 4-story brick building with rows of windows that glow yellow from the gas lamps inside. The building never goes dark. Day shift, night shift, Sunday shift, the machines never rest because resting machines don't make money, and making money is the only thing that matters in this new American economy. Katherine passes a group of children huddled around a small fire in an alley between 2 tenement buildings. They should be home sleeping, but home might be colder than the street, or there might not be room in whatever space their families have managed to rent. City children in the 1880s grow up fast or they don't grow up at all. These kids, probably between 8 and 12 years old, will be at their own factory jobs in a few hours, operating machinery that could easily kill them if they make a mistake. The night air carries sounds that would be impossible during the busy day. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoes as a freight locomotive hauls coal cars toward the steel mills. Closer, the rhythmic hammering from a foundry where men work through the night pouring molten metal into molds. The constant hiss of steam engines that power the machinery keeping Pittsburgh's industrial heart beating. As Katherine approaches the mill entrance, she joins a stream of other women and older children making the same journey. Most are Irish like her, but there are Germans, Italians, and even a few freed slaves who made their way north after the Civil War ended 20 years ago. They don't speak much to each other. Different languages, different backgrounds, but the same desperate need for wages that will keep their families fed for another week. The mill foreman, Mr. Heinkel, stands by the entrance with his pocket watch, checking each worker as they arrive. Late by even 2 minutes means lost pay. Late by 10 minutes means replacement by one of the desperate women who gather outside every night hoping someone won't show up. Heinkel's face never shows emotion. He views the workers as interchangeable parts in his machine, and parts that don't function properly get replaced. Katherine nods to him as she passes. No words exchanged, just the acknowledgement between supervisor and supervised that has kept this system running for decades. Inside, the mill is a cavern of noise and motion. Rows of spinning machines stretch across the floor, each one tended by a worker who must keep multiple threads running simultaneously. The air is thick with cotton dust that coats everything and everyone in a fine white powder that looks almost beautiful until you realize what it's doing to your lungs. You might think factory work in the 1880s was mindless, repetitive labor, and you'd be partially right. But there's also a skill to it that takes months to develop. Katherine can tell by sound alone when one of her machines is about to break a thread. She can adjust tension and speed based on the quality of the raw cotton. She can keep 6 machines running smoothly while half asleep from exhaustion. It's not the kind of skill that gets recognition or higher pay, but it's skill nonetheless. The night supervisor, Mrs. Brennan, walks between the rows of machines with the authority of someone who clawed her way up from the factory floor. She started as a spinner 15 years ago and now oversees 40 women and children on the night shift. Her promotion came at a cost, though. The other workers view her with suspicion, seeing her as someone who chose the company's interests over worker solidarity. Management sees her as barely more reliable than the workers she supervises. She exists in a lonely middle ground, trusted by neither side. Katherine takes her position at machines number 47 through 52. 6 cotton spinning machines that will be her entire world for the next 12 hours. The previous shift worker, a tired-looking German woman named Greta, quickly explains any problems with the equipment before hurrying home to sleep for a few hours before taking care of her children while her husband works the day shift at the steel mill. This handoff happens twice every day at mills across America. Exhausted workers briefing their replacements on the quirks and problems of machines that run continuously. No time for proper maintenance, no budget for backup equipment. Everything runs until it breaks, then gets fixed just enough to keep running until it breaks again. As Katherine begins her work, threading cotton through the spinning mechanisms, her mind settles into the rhythm that will carry her through the night. This is perhaps the strangest part of industrial work in the 1880s. Your body performs complex, skilled tasks while your mind travels elsewhere. Katherine thinks about her sister Mary, who stayed in Ireland and married a farmer. Is she better off working someone else's land for subsistence, or is Katherine better off working someone else's machines for wages? The question has no clear answer, which is why it's perfect for occupying 12 hours of repetitive work. The mill's gas lamps cast everything in yellow light that flickers occasionally when the wind outside affects the gas pressure. Electric lighting exists in 1884, but it's expensive and unreliable. Most factories stick with gas because it's cheaper, even though it fills the air with fumes and creates a constant fire hazard. Worker safety comes second to cost efficiency in this new industrial age. Around 2 in the morning, one of Katherine's machines jams. The cotton thread has wound itself around a gear mechanism in a way that will require careful unwinding to prevent breaking the entire batch. This is the kind of problem that separates experienced workers from newcomers. A novice might panic and try to force the jam loose, potentially damaging expensive machinery and losing a day's pay. Katherine has seen this jam before. She signals Mrs. Brennan, who approaches with the tired irritation of someone who has dealt with mechanical problems every night for years. Together, they carefully work the tangled thread loose, their hands moving with the practiced precision of surgeons. Neither woman speaks during this process. They communicate through nods and gestures, a language developed through shared experience with temperamental machinery. The jam cleared, Katherine's machines resume their steady rhythm. Thread spinning onto bobbins that will be collected and sent to weaving mills where the cotton will become fabric. From there, to garment factories where immigrant women like Katherine will sew the fabric into clothes that middle-class Americans will buy without thinking about the hands that made them possible. Sunday morning in Pittsburgh arrives not with church bells, but with the slightly softer rumble of reduced industrial activity. The blast furnaces still burn, the steel mills still operate, but at perhaps 60% of their weekday intensity. Even in 1884, American industry acknowledges the Sabbath, though more from worker demands than religious conviction. Katherine O'Brien wakes in the bed she shares with her younger sister Molly in their family's single room above Murphy's Tavern on Smithfield Street. The room costs them $14 a month, nearly half of what Katherine earns at the textile mill, but it's their own space. No sharing with strangers, no sleeping in shifts, no waiting in line to use a communal privy that serves 40 families. Luxury, by Pittsburgh's immigrant standards. The morning light filtering through their one small window reveals a space that would fit inside a modern walk-in closet, but Katherine and her family have arranged it with the efficiency of people who understand that every square inch matters. 2 beds, one for Katherine and Molly, another for their parents. A trunk containing their combined possessions. A small table that serves for meals, sewing, and the occasional letter writing. A single chair that rotates between family members based on need and hierarchy. You're probably wondering how 4 adults share a space smaller than your bathroom, and the answer is the same way millions of American immigrants managed it, through elaborate systems of privacy and consideration developed over generations of necessity. You learn to dress quietly while others sleep. You learn to have conversations in whispers. You learn that personal space is a luxury that only wealthy people can afford. Molly stirs beside her, still young enough at 16 to sleep deeply despite the constant noise from the tavern below. Katherine envies her sister's ability to find rest anywhere. 3 years of night shifts have left Katherine's sleep patterns permanently disrupted. She rarely sleeps more than 4 hours at a stretch, even on Sundays when the mill doesn't require her presence. From the next bed comes the sound of her father's coughing, the deep, rattling cough that has worsened every month since they arrived in America. Patrick O'Brien works in the blast furnaces, breathing superheated air filled with coal dust and metal particles for 12 hours every day. The company doctor, when pressed, admits that furnace workers rarely live past 50. Patrick is 43. Her mother, Bridget, is already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed darning socks by the weak morning light. Even on Sunday, her hands never rest. During the week, she takes in laundry from families slightly more prosperous than theirs. On Sundays, she mends their own clothes and prepares for the coming week. The economics of poverty leave no room for true rest. Katherine rises quietly, dresses in her one good dress, the blue cotton one she brought from Ireland and has altered twice as her body changed from girl to woman. Sunday is the only day she doesn't wear her mill clothes, and the transformation feels almost magical. For a few hours each week, she can imagine herself as something other than a factory worker whose hands are permanently stained with cotton dust and machine oil. Downstairs, Murphy's Tavern is closed but not empty. The proprietor, Seamus Murphy, sits at a corner table with his account books, trying to figure out how to keep his business solvent when most of his customers live one paycheck from destitution. Murphy emigrated from Cork the same year as Katherine's family, and his tavern serves as an unofficial community centre for Irish immigrants in their neighbourhood. Morning, Katherine, Murphy nods as she passes through to the street. Tell your DA I've got news about the union meeting. Katherine nods but doesn't respond. Union talk is dangerous territory in a company town where the steel mills own not just the factories but most of the housing, stores, and even the police. Workers who get too involved in labor organizing often find themselves unemployed and blacklisted throughout the region. Patrick O'Brien walks a careful line between supporting workers' rights and keeping his job. The street outside transforms on Sunday mornings into something approaching community life. Children who spend weekdays working in textile mills and glass factories play elaborate games involving bottle caps and pieces of rope. Women gather in small groups, sharing information about which stores have the best prices, which landlords are raising rents, which factories are hiring or laying off workers. This informal network of information sharing serves as the neighborhood's economic intelligence system. In an era before labor protection or unemployment benefits, knowing which company is expanding or contracting can mean the difference between steady work and starvation. The women particularly excel at this intelligence gathering, perhaps because their survival often depends more on community connections than individual wage earning. Katherine walks towards St. Patrick's Church, a modest wooden building that serves the Irish Catholic community. The church was built entirely through donations from steelworkers and mill hands, constructed on weekends by men who spent their regular hours building industrial America. The result is sturdy but plain, a working-class house of worship that makes no architectural claims to grandeur. Father McMahon stands at the entrance greeting parishioners as they arrive for morning mass. He's a young priest, barely 30, sent from Boston to minister to Pittsburgh's growing Irish population. Unlike the established Catholic churches in wealthier neighborhoods, St. Patrick's operates on a budget that barely covers basic expenses. Father McMahon's vestments are simple cloth, and the church interior lacks the ornate decorations common in more prosperous parishes. What St. Patrick's lacks in luxury, it compensates for in community. These Sunday gatherings serve multiple purposes beyond religious worship. They provide a weekly forum for sharing information about jobs, housing, and family news. They offer one of the few social spaces where Irish immigrants can gather without suspicion from the broader community. And they maintain connections to the homeland through letters read aloud and stories shared about family members still in Ireland. Katherine takes her usual seat near the back, partly from habit and partly because mill workers' clothes, even their best clothes, carry permanent stains and smells that mark their social position. The front pews are occupied by the few Irish families who have achieved modest prosperity, shop owners, and skilled craftsmen who can afford better housing and newer clothes. Father McMahon's sermon focuses on endurance through hardship, a theme particularly relevant to his congregation. He speaks about job suffering and faith, drawing parallels to the daily struggles his parishioners face in industrial America. The message isn't subtle, but subtlety is a luxury that working-class congregations can't afford. They need direct, practical guidance for surviving in a system that treats human beings as expendable resources. During the collection, Katherine contributes 2 pennies, a significant portion of her weekly discretionary income. The money will help maintain the church building and support Irish families experiencing particular hardship. This mutual aid system operates parallel to the official charity organizations, providing help based on community knowledge rather than bureaucratic assessment. After Mass, the congregation lingers outside the church, extending the social aspect of their gathering. Children who have been sitting quietly through the service explode into activity, playing games that echo across the neighborhood. Adults cluster in groups organized by workplace, family connections, and shared interests. Katherine joins a group of young women, mostly mill workers and domestic servants, who gather weekly to share news and offer mutual support. Today's discussion centers around rumors of wage cuts at several textile mills. The owners claim that increased competition requires reduced labor costs. The workers suspect that the owners simply want higher profits. These conversations serve an important economic function beyond simple gossip. Information about wages, working conditions, and employment opportunities circulates through the community faster than any official communication. A woman might learn about a job opening at a different mill, or hear advance warning about layoffs at her current workplace. Knowledge becomes a tool for survival in an economic system that provides workers with little security or advance notice. Sarah Flanagan, who works at the same mill as Katherine but on the day shift, shares news that management has been interviewing replacement workers. This information sends a ripple of concern through the group. Replacement workers usually signal either planned layoffs or preparation for resisting worker demands for better conditions. The conversation is interrupted by the arrival of Katherine's brother Patrick, still in his work clothes despite it being Sunday. The blast furnaces operate continuously, and Patrick has been pulling extra shifts to earn money for winter coal. His face shows the exhaustion of someone who hasn't had a full day off in 3 months. "Ma wants you home," he tells Katherine. DA's cough is worse, and she's worried about the rent. Katherine nods, understanding the unspoken complexity of the situation. Her father's worsening health threatens the family's primary income source. Her mother's laundry work provides supplemental money but not enough to sustain the family alone. Katherine's mill wages, steady but small, might need to become the family's main financial support sooner than anyone wants to acknowledge. The walk home takes her through neighborhoods that tell the story of Pittsburgh's rapid industrial growth. Newer tenement buildings constructed hastily. The news travels through Pittsburgh's industrial district faster than the morning shift change. By 6:15 a.m. on a cold November morning in 1884, everyone within 3 miles of the Allegheny Textile Complex knows that something terrible has happened at Mill No. 7. Katherine O'Brien hears it first as shouting outside her tenement window, then as the rapid clanging of fire bells, and finally as the worried whispers of women gathering in the street below. Mill No. 7 houses the largest spinning operation in the complex, employing nearly 200 workers across 3 shifts. It's also where Katherine's cousin Ellen works the day shift, operating the same type of cotton spinning machines that Katherine tends during her night hours. The building is older than Katherine's mill, constructed 15 years ago when safety regulations were suggestions rather than requirements, and maintenance has been deferred repeatedly to keep costs low. Katherine dresses quickly in the dim morning light. She should be sleeping after finishing her night shift 3 hours ago, but sleep is impossible with the commotion outside and the growing knot of worry in her stomach. Ellen is 22, married to a steelworker, and 6 months pregnant with her first child. The timing couldn't be worse for any kind of industrial accident. Downstairs, Murphy's Tavern has become an impromptu information center as neighborhood residents gather to share whatever details they've managed to collect. Seamus Murphy stands behind his bar, coffee pot in hand, dispensing both caffeine and news to anyone who enters. The combination of genuine concern and morbid curiosity that drives people toward disaster scenes fills his establishment with an unusual morning crowd. Steam pipe burst, Murphy reports to Katherine as she enters. 3rd floor, near the main spinning room. They're saying at least a dozen hurt, maybe more. Katherine's heart sinks. The 3rd floor is exactly where Ellen works, operating 6 spinning machines near the building's main steam distribution system. Steam pipes in textile mills carry pressurized water vapor to power machinery and maintain humidity for cotton processing. When they fail, they release superheated steam at temperatures that can kill instantly and pressures that can knock grown men off their feet. The walk to Mill No. 7 takes Katherine through streets that showcase industrial Pittsburgh's complete transformation of the landscape. What was once rolling farmland now hosts a maze of factories, mills, foundries, and the supporting infrastructure required to keep them operating. Smokestacks pierce the skyline like artificial mountains, while railroad tracks crisscross the ground level, carrying raw materials in and finished products out. As Katherine approaches the mill complex, the scale of the emergency becomes clear. Fire department wagons line the street, their horses stamping nervously in the cold morning air. Ambulances, really just modified wagons with medical supplies, wait near the mill entrance. Most ominously, a hearse stands ready at the edge of the crowd, its black paint and brass fittings reflecting the weak November sunlight. The crowd of onlookers consists primarily of family members and friends of mill workers, people whose own livelihoods depend on the same dangerous industrial system that has just demonstrated its potential for destruction. They wait with the particular kind of patience that comes from understanding that information will arrive when it arrives, and that panic serves no useful purpose. Katherine finds her Aunt Mary, Ellen's mother, standing near the mill entrance with several other women whose daughters or sisters work inside. Mary's face shows the controlled terror of someone trying to remain functional while imagining the worst possible outcomes. She nods to Katherine but doesn't speak. Words feel inadequate in situations where the fundamental randomness of industrial accidents reminds everyone how little control they actually have over their own survival. The mill superintendent, Mr. Harrison, emerges from the building accompanied by a man Katherine recognizes as Dr. Morrison, one of the few physicians in Pittsburgh who treats working-class patients. Their faces reveal nothing, maintaining the professional neutrality required when delivering news that will fundamentally alter families' lives. Industrial accidents create a strange hierarchy of grief, with management and medical professionals maintaining emotional distance while family members experience raw terror and relief in alternating waves. The steam pipe failure occurred at approximately 5:45 a.m., Harrison announces to the gathered crowd. 14 workers were injured, with varying degrees of severity. 7 have been transported to Allegheny General Hospital for treatment. The others received medical attention on site and have been released to their families. The announcement creates more questions than it answers. 14 injured, but no mention of fatalities. 7 hospitalized, but no indication of their conditions. Harrison's careful language reflects the mill owner's concern about legal liability and public relations rather than genuine communication with worried families. Dr. Morrison steps forward with a list of names, reading them in alphabetical order without editorial comment. Katherine listens with growing relief as name after name passes without mention of Ellen. Then, Ellen McCarthy, transported to Allegheny General Hospital, condition stable. The relief is overwhelming but incomplete. Stable condition could mean anything from minor burns to injuries that will permanently disable Ellen's ability to work. In 1884, industrial workers injured on the job received no compensation from their employers and limited medical care from hospitals that view charity cases as financial burdens. Ellen's husband Michael earns decent wages at the steel mill, but not enough to support a family if Ellen becomes unable to contribute household income. Katherine and Aunt Mary join the stream of family members walking toward Allegheny General Hospital, a 2-mile journey through neighborhoods that reveal Pittsburgh's stark economic divisions. The mill district gives way to modest middle-class housing, then to the more prosperous area near the hospital where doctors, lawyers, and successful merchants live in houses with multiple rooms, indoor plumbing, and front yards large enough for children to play safely. Allegheny General Hospital was built 5 years ago with funding from Andrew Carnegie and other steel industry magnates, partly from genuine philanthropy and partly from recognition that injured workers need medical care to return to productive employment. The building's imposing stone facade and modern medical equipment represent the latest in hospital design, though access to care still depends heavily on patients' ability to pay. The hospital's waiting area segregates patients and families by economic class and ethnicity. Irish immigrants like Katherine and Mary wait in a section with wooden benches and minimal decoration. German and Eastern European families occupy a slightly better area with padded chairs. The wealthy receive private rooms and immediate attention from the hospital's most experienced physicians. This segregation system reflects broader social hierarchies in industrial America, where medical care, like housing and employment, follows patterns of ethnic and economic discrimination. Irish Catholics occupy the bottom rungs of Pittsburgh's social ladder, viewed with suspicion by Protestant establishment families and competing for jobs with newer immigrant groups willing to work for even lower wages. A nurse eventually calls Mary's name, leading her to a ward where steam burn victims occupy beds separated by thin curtains. Katherine waits outside, studying the faces of other family members who display the particular exhaustion that comes from maintaining hope while preparing for disappointment. Industrial accidents create a shared experience of vulnerability that temporarily breaks down some of the ethnic and religious barriers that typically divide working-class communities. Mary emerges after 20 minutes with tears in her eyes, but tears of relief rather than grief. Ellen has suffered severe burns on her arms and hands, injuries that will require weeks of recovery and leave permanent scarring. However, the burns missed her face and torso, and the baby appears unaffected by the accident. She'll survive, though her ability to perform detailed manual labor may be permanently compromised. The walk back to their neighborhood passes more quickly than the journey to the hospital, partly because they now have concrete information to process rather than abstract fears to manage. Ellen will spend at least a week in the hospital, followed by several more weeks of recovery at home. Michael's wages from the steel mill will need to support both Ellen's medical expenses and their household costs during her recovery period. Katherine finds herself calculating the family's financial situation with the automatic precision of someone who has learned to balance survival against insufficient resources. Ellen's meal wages, about $8 per week, represent a significant portion of their household income. Medical expenses, even at the charity rates charged by Allegheny General, will consume most of Michael's savings. The timing, with winter approaching and a baby due in the spring, creates multiple layers of financial pressure. That evening, Katherine returns to her own mill for another night shift with a heightened awareness of the danger surrounding her. The steam pipes that power her spinning machines, components she has ignored for 3 years, now seem like potential weapons waiting to explode. Every unusual sound or vibration in the building triggers a moment of fear that subsides only when the machinery continues operating normally. Her fellow workers display similar tension as news of the mill number 7 accident circulates through the night shift. Industrial workers develop a fatalistic attitude toward danger as a psychological defense against constant risk, but specific accidents in nearby facilities break through that mental protection, forcing everyone to December 1884 arrives in Pittsburgh like an unwelcome creditor, demanding payment the city cannot afford. The first heavy snow falls on a Tuesday night while Katherine O'Brien tends her spinning machines, transforming the industrial landscape into something that might appear beautiful from a distance but reveals itself as another layer of hardship for those who must navigate it daily. Snow in an industrial city is nothing like the pristine winter scenes painted by artists for wealthy patrons. Within hours of falling, Pittsburgh's snow turns grey from coal smoke, then black from steel mill emissions, then into a treacherous slush that combines with horse manure and human waste to create a toxic mixture that coats every surface. The romantic notion of winter as a season of clean beauty simply doesn't exist in neighborhoods where survival takes precedence over aesthetics. Katherine watches the snow accumulate through the mill's windows as she works her night shift, already calculating the additional challenges it will create for her family. Their tenement room above Murphy's Tavern has no direct source of heat except for a small coal stove that burns through their fuel budget faster than their income can replenish it. The building's thin walls and single-pane windows provide minimal insulation against Pittsburgh's harsh winters. The mathematics of staying warm in 1880s Pittsburgh require constant negotiation between competing necessities. Coal costs money that could purchase food. Warmer clothes cost money that could pay rent. Additional blankets cost money that could cover medical expenses for Ellen, who is still recovering from her mill accident and struggling with infected burns that refuse to heal properly in the cold, damp conditions of industrial housing. By morning, when Katherine's shift ends, 6 inches of snow have fallen, with more predicted throughout the day. The walk home becomes an expedition requiring careful navigation of streets that transform into obstacle courses when winter weather meets inadequate municipal services. Pittsburgh city government focuses its snow removal efforts on commercial districts and wealthy neighborhoods, leaving working-class areas to manage with whatever community resources they can organize. Katherine's route takes her past scenes that would be familiar to anyone who has experienced urban poverty in winter. Children wearing clothes that provide insufficient protection against the cold, walking to factory jobs that will keep them indoors for 12 hours but require them to travel exposed streets twice daily. Adults bundled in layers of worn clothing that creates bulk without warmth, their faces displaying the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting both economic pressure and physical discomfort simultaneously. The corner market where Katherine's family purchases their weekly groceries displays winter pricing that reflects the seasonal economics of industrial cities. Fresh vegetables, already expensive luxuries for working families, become completely unaffordable when transportation costs increase due to weather. Potatoes, the staple food that has sustained Irish families through centuries of hardship, rise in price just when families need them most to provide filling, warming meals. Inside Murphy's Tavern, Seamus has started a fire in the establishment's small fireplace, creating a gathering place for neighborhood residents who cannot afford adequate heat in their own rooms. This informal warming center operates according to unspoken rules developed through community necessity. Families with young children receive priority access during the coldest hours. Adults working night shifts can rest here during day hours when their tenement rooms become unbearably cold. Katherine climbs the stairs to her family's room, each step releasing small puffs of visible breath in the unheated stairwell. The building's interior temperature hovers only slightly above the outside air, providing shelter from wind and precipitation but minimal protection against Pittsburgh's winter cold. The door to their room reveals a space that her family has transformed into a fortress against winter through ingenuity and determination. Every crack around windows has been stuffed with rags and newspaper to prevent drafts. Additional layers of clothing serve as supplemental blankets on the beds. The small coal stove burns continuously, fed with carefully rationed fuel that must last until Patrick receives his next weekly wages from the steel mill. Her parents and sister cluster around the stove, sharing its heat while performing their daily tasks of mending clothes and preparing meals. Patrick O'Brien's cough has worsened significantly since winter's arrival, a pattern common among steel workers whose lungs are already damaged from years of breathing superheated air filled with metal particles and coal dust. The cold air aggravates existing respiratory problems while the damp conditions in poorly heated housing promote infections that healthy people might easily overcome but can prove dangerous for workers whose bodies are already compromised by industrial exposure. Catherine's mother, Bridget, has adapted her laundry business to winter conditions by hanging wet clothes inside their small room, creating additional humidity that makes the space feel even colder while increasing the risk of mold and respiratory problems. The clothes freeze before they dry, requiring constant repositioning near the stove and careful timing to prevent damage to fabrics that customers expect to receive in good condition. The economic pressure of winter extends beyond immediate heating costs to affect every aspect of working-class life. Factory owners reduce wages during cold months, arguing that decreased productivity due to weather conditions requires cost reductions to maintain profitability. Workers who miss shifts due to illness or weather-related transportation problems lose pay without receiving any accommodation for circumstances beyond their control. Catherine's mill operates at reduced capacity during winter months, as machinery requires longer warm-up periods and cotton processing becomes more difficult in cold, dry air. These operational challenges translate into fewer working hours for employees, reducing their already inadequate wages precisely when their expenses increase most dramatically. The mill owners maintain their profit margins by transferring weather-related costs to workers who can least afford to absorb them. The neighborhood itself transforms during winter into a more dangerous environment where the normal risks of industrial urban life multiply. Icy sidewalks become treacherous for workers carrying heavy loads or walking to jobs before dawn. Coal smoke combines with fog to create air quality so poor that breathing becomes difficult for anyone with existing health problems. Frozen waste in outdoor privies creates sanitation hazards that won't resolve until spring temperatures return. Children face particular dangers during Pittsburgh winters, as their factory jobs require them to travel through dangerous conditions to workplaces that may not provide adequate heating. Child workers in glass factories, textile mills, and steel processing facilities often suffer from respiratory problems that worsen in cold weather, but missing work means lost wages that their families cannot afford to sacrifice. Catherine's cousin Ellen, still recovering from her mill accident, struggles with complications that winter weather has aggravated. The burns on her hands and arms have developed infections that resist healing in the cold, damp conditions of her tenement housing. Her husband Michael faces increased pressure at the steel mill, where winter weather creates more dangerous working conditions and longer hours to meet production quotas despite seasonal challenges. Sunday services at St. Patrick's Church become even more important during winter months, as the building provides one of the few heated spaces large enough to accommodate significant numbers of community members. Father McMahon adapts his sermons to address the specific challenges of surviving winter in industrial America, focusing on themes of endurance, mutual support, and faith in eventual improvement of conditions. The church also serves as a distribution center for winter relief supplies donated by more prosperous Catholic parishes in other parts of the city. Used clothing, blankets, and small amounts of coal arrive irregularly, distributed according to family size and perceived need through informal networks of community knowledge. These donations provide essential support but never enough to eliminate the fundamental problems of inadequate wages and expensive heating costs. Catherine's Sunday walks through the neighborhood reveal winter's impact on community life in industrial Pittsburgh. Streets that bustled with activity during warmer months become nearly empty except for essential travel. Children who played elaborate games in alleys and vacant lots disappear indoors, creating a silence that makes the constant industrial noise more noticeable and oppressive. The informal economic networks that sustain working-class communities adapt to winter conditions through creative cooperation and resource sharing. Families combine their coal purchases to negotiate better prices from dealers. Women coordinate cooking schedules to maximize the heat generated by stoves and ovens. Men organize work crews to clear snow from streets and sidewalks, creating temporary employment while improving neighborhood conditions. These survival strategies demonstrate the remarkable ingenuity and social cohesion that develop in communities facing shared hardship. Industrial capitalism in the 1880s provides working families with minimal security or support, forcing them to create their own systems of mutual aid and collective problem-solving. Winter weather intensifies these challenges while also strengthening the community bonds that make survival possible. As January approaches and the coldest months still lie ahead, Katherine reflects on the strange rhythm of seasonal survival in industrial America. Summer brings different challenges: heat and humidity in poorly ventilated factories, increased risk of disease in overcrowded neighborhoods, but also lower heating costs and more opportunities for supplemental income through outdoor work. Winter strips away any illusions about the adequacy of industrial wages for supporting working families. The additional costs of staying warm, eating properly, and maintaining. The trouble begins not with dramatic speeches or organized protests, but with a simple arithmetic that no longer adds up for working families in Pittsburgh. By March 1885, the cost of basic necessities has risen 15% while wages have remained frozen at 1,883 levels. Katherine O'Brien discovers this harsh reality while calculating her family's monthly expenses, spread across the small table in their tenement room like evidence in a trial where survival itself stands accused. Rent for their single room, $14. Coal for heating and cooking, $6. Food for 4 adults, $12 if they eat carefully, $16 if they don't want to go hungry. Katherine's monthly wages from the textile mill, $18. Her father Patrick's earnings from the steel mill, when his worsening cough allows him to work full shifts, $22. Her mother's laundry income, $4 on good months. Total family income, $44. Total expenses, $36 if everything goes perfectly, $42 if anyone gets sick or needs new clothes or encounters any of the dozen small emergencies that plague working families. The mathematics leave no room for savings, medical emergencies, or planning for the future. They also leave no room for the wage cuts that mill owners are demanding to maintain their profit margins against increased competition. The news reaches Katherine's neighborhood through the informal communication networks that carry information faster than any newspaper. Mrs. Kowalski from the next building heard it from her son who works at the Homestead Steel Works. Mr. Flanagan learned it from his brother-in-law at the Edgar Thompson plant. The Pennsylvania Railroad has announced a 10% wage reduction for all employees, effective April 1st. The steel mills are following suit. The textile factories are expected to announce similar cuts within days. 10% might not sound like much, but for families already living on the edge of survival, it represents the difference between eating regularly and going hungry, between staying warm and freezing, between paying rent and facing eviction. Katherine calculates quickly. A 10% reduction in her wages would cost her nearly $2 per month, enough to pay for coal during the coldest winter weeks or food during lean periods when her father cannot work. The response develops organically across Pittsburgh's industrial districts, not through central planning but through thousands of individual conversations in tenement hallways, factory break rooms, neighborhood taverns, and church gatherings. Workers who have never considered collective action find themselves discussing strike strategies with the urgency of people facing a common threat to their survival. Katherine first hears the word strike spoken aloud in Murphy's Tavern on a Thursday evening when she stops for a cup of coffee before her night shift. The conversation involves Patrick and several other steelworkers, their voices low but intense as they debate whether organized resistance might force the mill owners to reconsider the planned wage cuts. "They're counting on us accepting whatever they offer," says Michael McCarthy, Ellen's husband, his hand still bearing scars from steel mill work. Divided up into separate factories, separate trades, separate neighborhoods. They figure we'll grumble and complain but eventually go back to work for whatever wages they decide to pay. The strategy behind the owner's confidence becomes clear as Katherine listens to the men's discussion. Industrial workers in 1885 have no legal right to organize unions, no protection against employer retaliation, no unemployment benefits to sustain them during work stoppages. Most workers live paycheck to paycheck, unable to sustain their families for more than a week or two without wages. Yet something different is happening in the spring of 1885. The wage cuts affect so many workers simultaneously that individual resistance becomes collective action almost accidentally. When the Allegheny textile mills announce their 10% reduction, effective Monday, April 6, Katherine finds herself part of a movement that has emerged without formal leadership or explicit organization. Monday morning arrives gray and cold, with March snow still covering the streets in patches that have turned to black slush from industrial emissions and urban traffic. Katherine walks toward her mill at the usual time, but the streets carry an unusual tension. Groups of workers move in the same direction but with different energy, conversations more animated, faces more serious than the normal resignation of people heading to jobs they tolerate rather than enjoy. The first sign of change appears 3 blocks from the mill, where Katherine encounters a crowd of perhaps 50 workers gathered around someone standing on a wooden crate. The speaker is a woman Katherine recognizes from the neighborhood, Mary Sullivan, whose husband was killed in a foundry accident 6 months ago and who has been supporting 3 children on wages from the textile mill. "They want to cut our wages while their profits keep growing," Mary calls out, her voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air. "They live in mansions with servants and carriages while our children wear clothes with more patches than original fabric. They eat 3 meals a day while we skip meals to make sure our families have enough food to survive." The crowd around Mary grows larger as more workers stop to listen instead of continuing directly to the mill. Katherine finds herself drawn into the gathering despite her usual caution about activities that might result in job loss. Something about Mary's words resonates with the accumulating frustrations that Katherine has carried for 3 years of night shifts, inadequate wages, and watching her father's health deteriorate from steel mill work. "What are you proposing we do about it?" calls out a man Katherine doesn't recognize, probably from one of the other mills in the complex. "We don't go to work today," Mary responds simply. "Not until they agree to maintain our current wages. Not until they acknowledge that workers deserve enough pay to support their families with dignity." The idea hangs in the cold morning air like a challenge that everyone present must individually accept or reject. Katherine calculates quickly, missing 1 day of work costs her about 60 cents, money she cannot easily afford to lose. Missing multiple days could result in termination and blacklisting that would make finding other employment extremely difficult. Yet the alternative, accepting wage cuts that will make survival even more precarious, seems equally unacceptable. Katherine thinks about her family's budget calculations, about Ellen's medical expenses, about her father's declining health, about the impossibility of building any security for the future on wages that barely cover current necessities. The mill whistle sounds, calling workers to their morning shift. Normally, this signal would trigger an immediate movement toward the factory entrance as workers hurry to avoid being marked late. Today, the crowd around Mary Sullivan barely stirs. People look at each other, at the mill building, at the street leading back to their neighborhoods, weighing choices that could determine their family's survival. Katherine makes her decision not through careful analysis but through recognition of something that has been building inside her for months. The industrial system that employs her treats workers as interchangeable machine components, valuable only for their ability to operate equipment at minimum cost. The wage cuts represent a logical extension of this principle, reducing costs by transferring additional hardship to people who already live with barely adequate resources. Instead of walking toward the mill entrance, Katherine remains with the growing crowd in the street. Around her, dozens of other workers make similar decisions, creating a spontaneous work stoppage that surprises even the participants with its size and determination. By 7 a.m., when the morning shift should have begun production, nearly 200 workers have gathered outside the textile complex rather than reporting to their stations. The mill supervisors emerge from the building to observe the crowd with expressions that mix concern, anger, and calculation. Katherine recognizes Mrs. Brennan, her night shift supervisor, standing near the entrance with other management personnel. Their body language suggests urgent consultation about how to respond to a situation they clearly did not anticipate. The strike, for that is what the gathering has become despite its spontaneous origins, spreads throughout Pittsburgh's industrial district with remarkable speed. Workers arriving at steel mills, foundries, glass factories, and railroad yards encounter similar crowds and face identical choices between accepting wage cuts or risking unemployment through collective resistance. By noon, an estimated 15,000 workers across the city have joined what newspapers will later call the Great Pittsburgh Strike of 1885. The number surprises everyone, including the workers themselves, who discover that their individual grievances have coalesced into a movement large enough to shut down significant portions of the city's industrial production. Katherine spends the day with crowds of striking workers who gather in parks, outside factory gates, and in neighborhood meeting halls to discuss strategy and share information. The conversations reveal the breadth of support for the strike across ethnic and religious lines that normally divide Pittsburgh's working-class communities. Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, Italian immigrants, and freed slaves find common cause in opposition to wage cuts that threaten all their families equally. The city's response develops quickly as Mayor William McCarthy, himself of Irish descent but representing business interests rather than working-class constituencies, meets with mill owners and railroad executives to coordinate strategy against the strike. Police are mobilized to protect factory property and escort replacement workers who might attempt to cross picket lines. Katherine returns home that evening to find her family. 6 weeks later, Katherine O'Brien returns to work at the Allegheny textile mill carrying the weight of both victory and defeat in equal measure. The Great Strike of 1885 ended 3 days ago with an agreement that prevented the planned wage cuts but provided no increases to help workers cope with rising costs of living. Management agreed to maintain current pay scales through the end of the year and promised to consider worker safety concerns, concessions that feel simultaneously significant and inadequate. The mill building looks identical to how Katherine left it in early April, but everything else has changed in ways both visible and hidden. Some workers never returned, either terminated for strike activity or blacklisted throughout Pittsburgh's industrial network. Others returned to find their positions eliminated or their responsibilities increased to compensate for reduced staffing. A few, mostly skilled workers whose expertise proved difficult to replace, actually gained slightly better working conditions or informal assurances about job security. Katherine's own situation remains precarious but intact. Her position operating 6 cotton spinning machines was held open, partly because trained textile workers possess skills that require months to develop and partly because the strike's partial success made management cautious about creating additional labor unrest through arbitrary terminations. She returns to night shift work with the same wages, same hours, same dangerous machinery, but with a fundamentally altered understanding of her relationship to industrial capitalism. The past 6 weeks have educated Katherine and thousands of other Pittsburgh workers about both the possibilities and limitations of collective action. The strike demonstrated that coordinated resistance could prevent some employer abuses, but it also revealed the enormous economic pressure that working families face when they challenge business authority. Most strikers exhausted their savings within 2 weeks and relied on community support and credit extensions from sympathetic merchants to survive until the settlement. Katherine's family weathered the strike period better than many, thanks partly to Patrick's continued employment at the steel mill, where workers remained on the job while supporting the textile and railroad strikes through financial contributions and solidarity demonstrations. Bridget increased her laundry work to compensate for Katherine's lost wages, and the family reduced their already minimal expenses by eating less, using less coal for heating, and postponing any non-essential purchases. The neighborhood's informal support networks proved crucial for sustaining families whose primary wage earners participated in the strike. Murphy's Tavern became a food distribution center where families with resources shared meals with those facing hunger. St. Patrick's Church organized clothing exchanges and temporary housing for families threatened with eviction. Women like Katherine's mother coordinated child care arrangements that allowed mothers to attend strike meetings or seek temporary employment. These community responses revealed both the strength and fragility of working-class solidarity in industrial America. Mutual aid systems emerged quickly and effectively during the crisis, demonstrating remarkable organizational capabilities among people often dismissed as unskilled labor. However, the networks also highlighted the thin margins on which most families operate, with few resources available for extended support of neighbors in need. Katherine's first night back at the mill passes quietly as she reacquaints herself with machinery that feels simultaneously familiar and strange after 6 weeks of absence. The spinning process requires precise attention to thread tension, machine speeds, and cotton quality, skills that return quickly but must be carefully rebuilt to avoid production errors that could result in wage deductions or disciplinary action. Her fellow workers display a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and uncertainty about the future. Some express satisfaction with the strike's outcome, viewing the prevention of wage cuts as a significant victory that established workers' ability to resist arbitrary management decisions. Others focus on the personal costs they incurred, lost wages that will take months to recover, relationships strained by economic pressure, health problems aggravated by stress and inadequate nutrition during the strike period. Mrs. Brennan, the night shift supervisor, treats returning workers with careful neutrality, avoiding both punishment for strike participation and acknowledgement of worker concerns that motivated the work stoppage. Her position requires maintaining production efficiency while managing employees whose recent experience of collective action has altered their willingness to accept arbitrary authority. The balance is delicate and temporary, dependent on both sides' recognition that their relationship has fundamentally changed. The most significant changes become apparent in small daily interactions rather than dramatic policy announcements. Workers speak more openly about working conditions, safety concerns, and wage adequacy, conversations that were previously conducted in whispers or avoided entirely. Supervisors respond more carefully to worker complaints, aware that grievances ignored might evolve into organized resistance. Management provides slightly better maintenance for machinery and marginally improved safety equipment, minimal investments that acknowledge worker concerns while avoiding major cost increases. Katherine observes these subtle shifts while reflecting on the broader lessons of the strike experience. Industrial workers in 1885 possess more collective power than most realize, but exercising that power requires overcoming enormous economic and social obstacles. Successful resistance depends on timing, community support, and careful calculation of costs versus benefits that vary significantly among different groups of workers. The strike also revealed important divisions within Pittsburgh's working-class communities that will influence future labor organizing efforts. Skilled craftsmen often maintained better working conditions and higher wages that made them reluctant to risk their positions for broader worker solidarity. Immigrant groups sometimes competed for employment opportunities rather than cooperating against employer exploitation. Women and men faced different economic pressures that affected their ability to sustain extended work stoppages. Katherine's cousin Ellen, still recovering from her mill accident and now caring for a newborn daughter, represents the complex intersection of personal and economic challenges that industrial families navigate daily. Ellen's burns have healed sufficiently to allow light work, but she lacks the manual dexterity required for textile employment and faces discrimination from employers who view workers with disabilities as insurance risks and productivity liabilities. The strike's aftermath creates new opportunities and constraints for Ellen's family. Michael's support for the textile workers' cause has enhanced his standing among fellow steelworkers but may have damaged his prospects for supervisory positions that require management approval. Ellen's inability to return to mill work forces the family to survive on Michael's wages alone, a situation that thousands of industrial families face but few can sustain comfortably. Katherine's Sunday visits with Ellen provide opportunities to discuss the strike's long-term implications for working women in industrial Pittsburgh. The 6-week work stoppage demonstrated women's crucial role in both textile production and community organization, challenging assumptions about female workers' commitment and capabilities. However, it also highlighted the additional vulnerabilities that women face when they challenge employer authority, including sexual harassment, family pressure, and limited alternative employment opportunities. Father McMahon addresses the strike's spiritual and social dimensions in Sunday sermons that carefully balance support for worker rights with warnings against violence and radicalism. The Catholic Church's position on labor issues reflects its complex relationship with immigrant communities that provide most of its membership but also its dependence on donations from more prosperous parishioners who may oppose aggressive worker organizing. Katherine listens to these sermons while thinking about the moral dimensions of industrial capitalism that the strike has forced her to consider more carefully. The system that provides her employment also creates conditions that damage workers' health, separate families for long hours, and reduce human beings to production costs that must be minimized for competitive advantage. Religious teachings about justice and compassion conflict with economic realities that prioritize profit over human welfare. Summer arrives in Pittsburgh with its own challenges for industrial workers, as factory temperatures rise to dangerous levels and air quality deteriorates from increased coal consumption and reduced ventilation. Katherine's mill becomes nearly unbearable during heat waves, with spinning machines generating additional warmth in buildings designed for winter heating rather than summer cooling. Workers adapt by drinking larger quantities of water, taking more frequent breaks when supervisors permit, and wearing lighter clothing that provides less protection against machinery hazards. The strike's influence continues through informal changes in workplace dynamics that may prove more significant than the formal agreement that ended the work stoppage. Workers communicate more openly about production problems and safety concerns, creating pressure for improvements that management can address quietly without acknowledging union demands. Supervisors respond more carefully to worker complaints, recognizing that ignored grievances might escalate into organized resistance. Catherine's financial situation stabilizes gradually as her family recovers from the strike period's economic disruption. The prevention of wage cuts allows them to maintain their previous standard of living, barely adequate but sufficient for survival with careful budgeting. Patrick's health continues declining, but slowly enough that he can still work most shifts at the steel mill. Bridget's laundry business provides supplemental income that creates a small buffer against unexpected expenses. As autumn approaches and Katherine reflects on the year's events, she recognizes that the strike experience has fundamentally altered her